So it's a pleasure to have you all here. And firstly, I just want to thank Michael and Claire for all their work in organising this workshop. And I want to thank the speakers, Tobias, Juan, Claire, and Daniel, who will be joining us in a few minutes. So thanks very much. So I'm really looking forward to the workshop. My name is Lero Morgan. I know a good few of you. I lecture here in Business Information Systems, just over here. And I'm also a researcher with Lero. So without further ado, I can hand you over to Claire. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. Thanks, Lorraine, and thanks everyone for coming here today. We're delighted to see you. The view you have is of our wonderful audience here, so that'll be great for the interactive session. So welcome everyone who's come along. And today I'm here to speak about global open source trends, to give some context to the day of why we're talking about open source and what's been happening in the world of open source for the last little while. So my name is Clare Dillon. I've had a long journey that's taken me here to talk about open source today. I started in the startup ecosystem here in Ireland and moved up into big tech for 14 years, where I was involved in developer communities and working with developers in the island of Ireland. But in 2018, I left Microsoft and I first became aware or started working with open source communities. And my first experience with that was actually an InnerSource community. And some of you may be familiar with the InnerSource methodology, but it's essentially using open source methods internally in organizations to create proprietary code and gaining some of that great value. But InnerSource Commons, the community of InnerSource practitioners, is itself an open source project. So it's kind of learning by doing. And that was how I became involved in some of the organizations that were working around open source program offices, because many of the participants in InnerSource Commons were also in open source program offices. And it was through that work that I began to really understand the potential of open source from an economic and social impact perspective, and started thinking about what did that mean for Ireland, and started asking questions about what was happening around open source in Ireland. And because there was no clear answer, because there's no clear place to go to find out, I, along with some, in fact, others in this room, founded Open Ireland Network, which is a community about trying to raise to bring together the community of open source, folks interested in open source in Ireland, but also change the narrative in Ireland to help people be more aware about the potential opportunities surrounding open source. And actually, as a result of this whole journey, I actually left the private sector at the end of 2022 and began a PhD here at the University of Galway, and I am investigating open collaborative methods, basically InnerSource, and how that's implemented within organizations. But I also still work with some of those communities that are involved in creating open source program offices in academia. So that's my current role. So just to give you an overview of Open Ireland Network, it's about connecting the ecosystem here in Ireland. It's about creating awareness and showcasing the great work that is happening in Ireland around open source, increasing skills and removing blockers to those involved in the ecosystem. But let's have a look at what is open source. I'm hoping everyone here has a good idea of what open source is. So hands up if you know what open source is in the room here. So that's everyone. So I won't go into belabor the point, but for anyone online or in the future who may not be familiar, it's about open source code is visible to everyone. It's viewable. People can look at it, study it. It can be used and shared. There's a freedom to do that, and it can also be modified, which actually gives an awful lot of benefits to a global ecosystem who's trying to advance the whole area of technology. And of course, it's not just code. Most people who are involved in the open source ecosystem know that there are particular tools associated with the use and creation of open source. There are processes involved in that. There's a culture that comes along with open source technology, a culture of collaboration and openness and transparency that actually is very valuable to everyone, regardless of whether or not you're creating open source code. Indeed, that's a lot of what InnerSource focuses on. But open source is definitely maturing. So I do presentations about open source quite a lot, and I've often asked people, close your eyes and imagine an open source developer. And fundamentally, you get some picture that emerges that's kind of like this, a kind of a lone developer in a dark room. I put this up once and someone said, yeah, he wears the sandals. So there's a kind of an idea of these folks that are volunteers, they're on passion projects, they're doing it alone, in someone's basement, and that it's this idea of almost like a hacker culture, a kind of an informal hacker culture, in terms of how people perceive open source development. But of course, that's all changed in the last few years, because over the last 2 decades or more, basically the world of technology has come to understand more about the economic and social impact potential of open source technology. The idea of the fact that there are so many more commercial open source companies now who are out there making money based on services or many other ways that folks can base their business on open source technology, but still be commercially viable. There's a huge rise in investments from VCs into these types of companies. And there are many industry collaborations that could only happen through open source methods, and we'll hear about some of those today. And so industry in general are really thinking about open source in a completely different way. And there are new policies and regulations that are emerging from across the globe that push us towards open source technology based on the real benefits that they're seeing it from an economic and social perspective. And indeed, the professional approach to the use, the contribution, the creation of open source technology has been happening all along. So it is no longer a kind of a best efforts community volunteer effort. It is now a fundamental underpinning of the entire technology industry, and the way in which we can actually get better at using open source, contributing to open source, creating open source. If we all do that, then we actually are able to advance the entire tech industry, which is very exciting. Of course, in universities, there's been a long history of academic open source contributions. In fact, Linux, one of the most famous open source projects, was created while Linus Torvalds was actually in university. And there are incredibly successful open source communities in academia around things like SciPy or even the language R, but or R, as they would say if you're not from Ireland. But NumPy as well. So there's amazingly popular, huge scientific communities all centering around open source projects. And indeed, these days, open source software forms the basis of many research fields, things like computer vision. There are folks in that area that can't get published without being able to publish the source code, because of course you can't reproduce their efforts unless you have got the source code involved. But even across bioinformatics and environmental science, open source projects form the building blocks that are in place to help these efforts in terms of scientific endeavor. And why is it now that open source is probably gaining more momentum and more recognition in the world? Well, I think there's a number of areas. The first main one, certainly in organizations, is around code reuse. It's around efficiency and productivity. I mean, building software is a complicated endeavor these days. It's a complex endeavor. And it's hard to do. And if you had to start every software project from scratch, we wouldn't get anywhere. So code reuse becomes a fundamental, necessary aspect of building technology today, and open source code gives you a frictionless way to use other people's code, which is so important. And in doing so, it accelerates innovation. It allows you to build on the best of breed that's always out there, and allows that to happen in a faster way. So you don't have to get involved with your procurement department. You don't have to get involved with your legal IP transfer department. If you have a policy that allows you to consume open source, then developers can do that with agency. They can get what they need when they need it. And that's very, very important for accelerated development and productivity. It allows organizations to pool the resources. So when there's a common problem out there, instead of every organization in the world, every researcher in the world solving that problem for themselves, it allows you to pool your efforts so that you do that collaboratively, rising all boats. And that's a really key area that is a piece of value for open source. But it also means shared risk. So if something goes wrong, if there's a security bug found in that software, well, then everyone has an actual reason to get that fixed quicker. And it's been proven more recently, although in the past there might have been a myth that open source might have been less secure because people could see it. These days, perceptions are shifting. And certainly in the corporate world, there's evidence to say people think open source is more secure because it's in the open, because there's more of a reason to get things fixed quickly, whereas some bugs in closed source code may linger there forever. We don't know how long it's been there. But in the open source world, there's the motivation to get it fixed by many of the users very, very quickly. And again, I mentioned the social and economic impact. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a little while. But I think also the need for trust. So we all know the arguments and the discussions around the trust in the world is breaking down in everything, in our organizations, in our institutions, in technology. And if technology is going to have or realize its potential for good in the world, for impact in the world, then we have to trust it. And one way to do that is to be able to examine the source code so you can see what's happening. And even if it's not every individual doing that, it means that trusted partners can do that. And certainly when we think about governments and the major technology trends that are out there at the moment, trust informs an important part, and open source helps increase trust by making source code available to people to examine and check to see that it's doing what they think it's doing. So let's look at some of these trends. I'm not going to go into detail on these, but when you look at the tech industry, there are various reports to say that pretty much all of today's software in the world contains some open source. You would be hard pushed to find software that doesn't contain open source. So it's a fundamental building block of today's tech industry. 96% of the world's top 1 million servers run open source software. And that's pretty much a given and a field where open source dominates. And indeed, 90% of all cloud infrastructure runs on open source software. So pretty much it's everywhere in the tech industry. And indeed, I won't go into detail on this, but if you're interested, the Linux Foundation has some research guides which talk about trends in this area. I've actually picked out some of those trends in these slides, which are just from their infographic, which I find interesting. I'll just mention a couple of them here today, but I'll also share my slides with all attendees so you can have a look at these ones, but also the originating research. But you can see from these points, if you can scroll in, and some people in the room here might have to switch, but I'll just call out a few. For example, 90% of organizations surveyed use open source at a moderate, significant, and widespread level. I think it's really interesting. I mentioned earlier about the perception that open source is more secure than closed source software. That's a perception that's now growing. Improved quality, productivity. These are reports that are coming back from industry to say this is why open source is so important. I'll also mention that from a European perspective, there is a lot of focus on social change and the potential impact from that perspective. And also the fact that it's being tied a lot to this emergence of general AI or generative AI. So Gen AI, a lot of folks are calling or acknowledging the fact that if you are getting involved in doing engineering around generative AI, then you're going to be working on open source models. For the most part, those are the ones that are available to develop upon. And because of that, this is causing a new interest in open source as well. It's vital to the future of industry sectors. So this is not just around the tech industry. It's fundamentally across industry, and vertical specific open source projects are becoming popular. There's a lot to do with European public sector, and they're realizing the potential for sharing source code across nations. And indeed, even in specific industry sectors like the financial services, they're talking a lot about how open source development not just increases productivity, but actually this report also talks about it making developers happier and more feeling better about their work as well. So it really gives benefits across the board. In terms of economic impact, there's a really great paper that was just released this year, which talks and tries to establish the actual value of open source. And it talks about the fact that they estimate that the supply side value of open source is about 4.15 billion. That would be the cost to recreate all the software that's currently available in open source code. But actually, in terms of usage, the value is $8.8 trillion. So think about that in terms of economic impact to our broader industry. If firms would need to spend about 3.5 times more on software than they do at the moment if open source software did not exist. And indeed, a European Commission study that was released a number of years ago talked to the point that open source software contributes about between 65 and 95 billion to the EU's GDP. And if we increased our open source contributions in Europe, we would generate a between 0.4 and 0.6% GDP increase, and an additional 600 startups would be created as a result of having access to that latest technology. So all across the board, open source has been proven to provide economic value at a meta level and even at a micro level, like when you're talking about the ability for startups to get started and to be connected to these amazing innovative areas. So also, it's very important to think about that social impact. So alongside the potential positive economic impact at a regional, at an organizational level, and even at an individual level, you have this potential to have a positive social impact at the same time. Who doesn't love that? So the UN talks a lot about how if we're working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, if we're building technology that is going to help solve the biggest world problems at a global level, including giving the accessibility to those people who cannot afford to purchase software, then you want to be talking about doing that in an open source way. And by the way, it's not just that reasoning for being able to use the software everywhere. If we're really going to solve the world's problems, we need to engage developers in the global south. We need to be able to accept contributions from the people whose lives are being impacted by these crises. And so open source gives us a way to do that, a mechanism and a process and the tools by which we can engage the global community of talent to help address these global problems in the world today. And so if you look at the UN's websites around this, digitalpublicgoods.net, you can see that they're very focused on open source software alongside open data, open AI models and open standards that would be best practices to help attain sustainable development goals. And it's an important part of the approach to us getting to those sustainable development goals. And they talk a lot about why that's important, and I won't go through those points. But for many reasons, open source software is the way to go with developing technology that addresses these sustainable development goals. And for people here in the room today, I know you will be also interested in this idea of open research and why that's important. So open research practices, open source software is an important part of open research and is there in the European Commission's definition of open science and open research, and it's an important part of that. And indeed, it's not just in the European Commission, in the UNESCO's recommendation on open science, in Ireland's national open research plan, in the European Commission recommendations around preservation of scientific information, over in the US in the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. All of these organizations are pushing us towards using open source software for reproducibility, for accessibility, for trust, for responsible software development. This is a global trend that's not going to stop. Indeed, this is a broader discussion from the European Commission about the importance of open source for better European services that enrich society. And indeed, we had Barry Lowry at an event last year where he talked about the fact that in the Irish government, we're also seeking to collaborate more with both other developers in Ireland, but also across the EU to provide better services in Ireland and to maybe share them with the world. So I'll briefly now just go into some of the things about what's happening in Ireland, because again, in some of my discussions across Ireland, there is maybe a lingering perception that somehow we're not as active in the open source scene here in Ireland as other geographies, but that's not the case. So when you actually look at the figures from GitHub's innovation graph, which is a new analytical tool that they have just put out, you can see that in Ireland, there's been a huge growth over the last 3 years between 2020 and 2023 in terms of the number of organizations contributing to open source projects, the number of developers contributing to open source development projects. Again, moved from 145,000 to 275,000 folks being associated with the geographic location of Ireland, contributing to GitHub. That's not even a complete view, of course, of everyone that does open source software. But I think the trend here is important in terms of it seeing that there's huge growth in Ireland. And indeed, if you look at some of the figures that they show, and you think about the per capita developer numbers that are actually contributing to open source software, we perform really well relative to the EU, the UK, and the US based on these figures. And indeed, the developer growth in Europe in particular, in terms of folks contributing to open source software, is one of the highest in the world. And if you look at where these collaborations are happening, I think this is really interesting as well. You can see flow of contributions going from Ireland to the US. You can see coming from the US to Ireland. What's particularly interesting is actually the fact that the largest incoming cohort of contributions is coming from the EU into Irish open source projects. So you can see in graphs like this, those collaboration networks happening, and I know we'll hear more about that later, but what open source software gives us is an ability to collaborate with our colleagues near and far, and to bring the people who are interested in solving the world's hardest problems together to do that very quickly and easily and in a frictionless way. So I'll leave now by handing over to some of my colleagues to help, and we need the link from Daniel's presentation as well, but we will move straight on now to hear from some of our other speakers who are going to speak today on some of the other aspects that are particularly of interest to folks in the research community around open source software. So thank you very much for listening. And I'll